From the hills of Hong Kong to the streets of San Francisco, our next guest has been making headlines and making change on behalf of the LGBT community and doing good work for AIDS, HIV awareness. Let me welcome Cecilia Chung. Welcome. Thank you so much. You know, I brought this with me because I just wanted to read your credits, because you've only been in San Francisco 20 years, but you've done much more than most people would in that time. You have broken ground as the first transgender woman and first Asian to be elected to lead the board of directors of the San Francisco Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Pride Celebration, the first transgender woman and first person living openly with HIV to chair the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, and an architect of the nation's most ambitious publicly funded program addressing economic justice within the transgender community. What do you do for relaxation?
Not a whole lot. So actually, I've been here since 1984, but I feel that I have been kind of like oblivious with the gay politics scenes, you know, like when I was in college. And it wasn't until I tested HIV positive that I actually got involved with HIV activism, and that was in the early 1990s, and since then I just felt I have a lot to catch up, so to speak, and so you know I guess I just didn't slow down much since then. Yeah.
When that diagnosis was made, I'm sure you remember that day, and what did that do to you?
So you know, like I think that most people now, especially the younger generations, didn't get the impact it had in older folks like me. Well, I think that most people, if they have lived through the 80s and the early 90s, they would remember we didn't really have any medications for HIV until the mid-90s.
Yeah, the cocktails came about like 94, 95, as I recall.
94, 95, exactly. You know, in the early days, we didn't even have AZT. It was just on trial, and then there are some underground therapies, you know, that people were trying. And so that was when I tested positive, and I still remember the HIV counselor that I had. It was in Mission Neighborhood Services. He told me that most people who tested positive only had about 6 months to a year, and he told me I should just got all my, you know, affairs in order, and maybe, you know, tell my family and say my goodbyes and prepare myself. So that was the time I was in, and so it was a shock. And as an Asian, the eldest of 2 kids, it wasn't really a very good feeling, and you know, and I really didn't remember a whole lot, you know, like for.
I mean, it was literally a death sentence.
It was literally a death sentence, and at that time I was only 28, and I just graduated college not that long ago, and so. I really didn't know what to think. You know, I just came out as transgender. I transitioned, and I really thought that, oh my God, that's God's way of punishing me. Did
you really feel that, or was that part of that old cultural baggage that you brought with you from China?
Most certainly was a cultural baggage that I carried with me. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I was also Catholic. You know, and so
that's a double whammy.
That was definitely a double whammy. So, and you know, so that was really a lot of negative emotions, you know, going through my head. So, and I didn't really know what to do. So, I turned to one of the AIDS organizations that serve, you know, the Asian and Pacific Islander community, and I spent a lot of times, you know, trying to find a way to connect, you know, with a community that I can relate to, you know, which is the Asian and Pacific Islander community. And at that time, they had the very first, you know, outreach program to the transgender community. And the organization at that time was called Asian AIDS Project, which is the predecessor of the API Wellness Center today.
Yes.
So and I spent a lot of times, doing volunteer work, and I later on became a staff, and I just trying to figure out what to do with myself, because I didn't think I have a lot of time to live.
So literally, because of the advent of AZT and the cocktails, that saved your life. You went from thinking you had 6 months to live to not thinking you'd be here in 2012 talking about these issues.
Yes, and I did have a lot of period of time when I got really, really sick. And what really helped me a lot was clinic like Tom Waddell Health Center, and friends, and a good support system in my life. At that time, I didn't really have good relationship with my family. They didn't really know how to deal with my gender identity, and so I had 3.5 years of my life that I didn't have a good relationship with them. And
were your these are your parents, and your one
parents.
sibling, brother, sister?
Sister.
All still in Hong Kong?
No, they were here already, but they, I couldn't really say that, they disowned me, but I think that they really had to go through their own struggle to find ways to accept me.
They didn't embrace you right away and say, "We're so happy you found yourself, Cecilia."
It's not in our culture to do that. So, and it was a very rough journey for all of us. So, and it wasn't until 1995 that my mom finally came around, and of course, now it seems like everything is water under the bridge, but it took a while to get.
Well, what is it? I could be wrong, but I understand there's a Chinese tradition that it takes 28 generations to get through any difficult thing. So she probably came through it pretty quickly then. Yeah.
Well, if that's the saying, yeah, then relatively speaking.
Yeah. Now, San Francisco has been known as a city that was Asia-focused for a long time. Certainly for those of us in the LGBT community, it's been a shining beacon on the hill. You wear many cultural hats, many identities. Do you ever stop and think, wow, that's a lot? I've become an internationally known advocate for people living with HIV/AIDS. I've become an internationally known advocate for the transgender community. And certainly you're very high profile in the Asian Chinese community. Is it ever just too much on those shoulders?
I think that it's not that I think that way. So what I have realized, though, because of all the lessons that I've learned and all the experience I had through my own journey, that there are a lot of similarities in many different communities. And interestingly, I've served on the Human Rights Commission for 7.5 years. And what it came down to for me is that it's all about human rights, fundamentally. And it's what kind of quality of lives that we fundamentally deserve and we are all entitled to as human beings.
Right.
So, and so rather than looking at what boxes we have to check on a form, we should be asking ourselves that basic questions. What are the common goals we are trying to achieve? So instead of saying that, oh, I'm taking on this community, I'm taking on that community, I'm going back to the basic, so
that it's all a human right.
It's about accessing basic human rights.
Having said that, even in San Francisco, which has been known as a community that celebrates diversity, I remember when I moved here 25, 26 years ago, the T in LGBT was still something that a lot of people, I'll include myself, had no real experience of. And I remember there was landmark legislation that has been promoted in this city that people said, oh my goodness, why do we have to deal with that issue? Do you think that still exists, or do you think now, I'm talking specifically about the LGBT community, we are one community, or do you still see some factualizations?
Interesting you asked that question, David. I think that when we first adopted the umbrella term, and the key operative word is umbrella, back in the early 90s, transgender is supposed to be a very all-encompassing umbrella term, and it's for transsexual, cross-dressing, a feminine gay man, and butch lesbians, and even just a feminine man or, you know, like butch woman could be classified under, you know, like transgender. So because the word trans has a Latin root to it, which means, you know, like just cross-gender norm. You know, so and it's really about like creating a category to protect people from being discriminated because they don't fit, you know, a social norm, and it's not supposed to be like being looked at as, you know, some kind of medical definition.
No, understood. But I've noticed just within my own community over the last 25 years a growing awareness and a growing education going on.
That's correct. However, you know, this is where, you know, I think that, you know, because we are so ever evolving and people trying to like fit, as I mentioned before, we are so like good at trying to like make sure that we can fit people into boxes. And when people don't fit into boxes, we don't know what to do with them. And when we don't know what to do with them, we tend to just like set those people into aside, you know, like put them into a corner.
Right.
And that's our tendency. And I think that we still do that, you know, like because, you know, 10, 15 years ago, we don't really see as many people that would step forward and identify as, let's say, genderqueer.
That's right, self-identified as genderqueer or transgender.
Yeah,
yes,
because gender identity and gender expressions are two separate things. And we see more people who feel comfortable enough or safe enough to come forward as genderqueer. But as you probably are aware as well that, you know, the task force, the LGBT task force, have recently, you know, published a new report and findings that, you know, genderqueer communities have actually experienced a different set of discriminations themselves. So, and it speaks volume to the kind of biases, you know, that we have amongst ourselves, and also, you know, like the community at large has, you know, like toward, you know, like gender variant people.
Right.
So I think that it's really about continuing education, and people still argue about, you know, like why should we put people who sexual orientations and people who have gender identity together and lump them into one community.
Well, we still have states like North Carolina that are trying to decide, you know, should we exist in any equal fashion at all? In our last few moments, do you see a time when this work won't be necessary? I mean, for instance, I remember when I was a young man, the idea of being married to a same-sex partner, it wasn't part of my consideration. Do you see a time when you're identified in an interview, it will just be Cecilia Chung, not listing your resume? Do you feel hopeful about that?
We need to always have hope, as Harvey Milk said, right? You know, and I think that, you know, like we hopefully will see that coming. You know, like recently, EEOC had issued a ruling to say that, you know, like employers cannot discriminate against people based on their gender identity, that transgender people can file complaints, you know, under Title VII, which is, you know, like sex discriminations under the Civil Rights Code. And, you know, that's a giant step forward.
So you do, so even though there's work to be done, you're hopeful?
Very hopeful.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Cecilia Chung. We appreciate her being on our show. Next up, we're going to meet one of the people that helped invent gay Christianity, Jim Metulsky. We'll be right back.